And good morning. How's everybody doing today? Welcome to Psychology 150. It is Dr. Rod Berry, your professor, coming to you live from Willow Springs, North Carolina. Looks like the broadcast is coming through clear. Looks like we have a guest in the classroom today. How are you doing? It's week 8. You know that this is exam week, so we have an exam coming up that we're going to have to do this weekend. Hi, Eric. I've already got, if you will look on Blackboard, you will notice that there's already an exam review YouTube broadcast scheduled for Friday morning at 9 a.m. Good to see you, Angelina. Thanks for coming into class today, too. So we've got Eric and Angelina. So the exam is coming up this weekend. There is a live review session this Friday morning at 9 a.m. on YouTube. If you're interested, of course, it will be recorded, and I'm going to go over the exam piece by piece on Friday so that you can prepare for the exam on Sunday. All right. Any questions? Any questions? I see we have a couple more people coming into the broadcast. Just wanted to remind you that we do have an exam this weekend, and there will be an exam review 9 a.m. Friday morning. The link is already in your exam folder along with a review sheet. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so today actually we're talking about IQ testing. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of the test. We're going to talk a little bit about, let me change my back. There we go. We're going to talk about the invention of IQ testing. We're going to talk about the properties of IQ tests. We're going to talk about the evaluation of IQ tests, and we're going to talk about newer theories of intelligence. That's sort of what we're going to cover in this particular chapter. Today we're going to talk about the invention of IQ testing, where it's used, who does it, and then we'll talk a little bit about what's on the test. Any questions so far today? Those of you who just showed up in the chat box, I have a question for you. These people that you see right here, this little girl won the spelling bee. She's holding the big trophy up there. We've got Albert Einstein over here writing some sort of equation up there. Right beneath me is a rapper, Eminem, who is sometimes seen as maybe one of the best rappers of all time. You see Oprah Winfrey down there in the bottom right. And then you see Alan Eustace, who is a Google executive who's broken the record for the most free falls ever. Which one of these people would be thought of as intelligent? What does it mean to be intelligent? Does anybody have an idea? When you meet somebody, how do you know if they are intelligent? Angelina, Eric, any of you that are on the broadcast, how can you tell somebody is intelligent? Okay. Now, we're going to adopt a definition here. This does not mean this is the complete definition of intelligence. And in fact, when we get to the end of the lecture on Thursday next week, I'm actually going to argue with you that it's very hard to even think of intelligence as one unique thing. But let's think of it as the ability to use knowledge to reason, make decisions, make sense of events, to solve problems, to understand complex ideas, to learn quickly, and to adapt to environmental challenges. Notice nowhere in this article does it say be creative. Nowhere in this article, nowhere in this definition does it say be funny. None of those things are included. None of this, it doesn't say be poetic or anything like that. So this is sort of an a definition of intelligence is sort of based on your ability to compute things. And we're going to go with that for a while. All right. Now, the question is, can you even really think of intelligence as one thing? Can you describe it coherently? Hard to say. And given the fact that it's so hard to describe, how difficult is it to measure? What I'm going to try to convince you in this week is that we can measure this thing called IQ, which is related to intelligence, quite easily and make very fine-grained comparisons among people. But to measure truly what it means to be intelligent, I'm actually going to argue to you that that is very, very difficult, right? And then we're going to ask the question, is it really useful to be intelligent? What is the value of intelligence? Does it necessarily make you a human being? And how close is this relationship between intelligence and success? So, what do you think it means to be intelligent? What is it? What's its impact and outcome? And do you think we can even compare people on this concept? Intelligence is a very interesting topic in human functioning. Now, you can think of intelligence as sort of cognitive psychology, but it actually predates the cognitive psychology revolution by about 50 years. Intelligence as a human capacity started early, just like the study of personality as a human capacity, way back in the 19th century. Okay, so although you can think of cognitions, your ability to create cognitions as a part of your intelligence, intelligence has a different history than cognitive psychology altogether. Okay, now why do we talk about intelligence? Because IQ tests are absolutely everywhere in your world. IQ tests have gone from non-existent in 1900 to probably being one of the important human measurements that rules your life today. Where do we see them? Well, you know what? You're going to see them in schools, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later today. They use pencil and paper tests to sort you into those students who are going to gifted education. I don't know if any of you ever went into gifted education before, but you had to pass 2 IQ tests and score in the 95th percentile on both of those tests to get yourself into the gifted program in 3rd grade. Now, what you're going to see is school psychologists will also use the individual one-on-one IQ tests when they're evaluating a student for a learning disorder. So some of you who've been diagnosed with learning disorders, especially if it happened early in your academic career, you probably took an individually administered IQ test to help evaluate what type of learning disorder you had. Now, you're going to find that courts also use IQ tests. So you'll see them in forensic psychology, not only school psychology, but forensic psychologists. And you'll sometimes see them in court cases where they're looking at an individual's culpability. Did you know that in the United States it's considered unconstitutional to execute somebody who is diagnosed as having as being mentally retarded? It's actually against the law. So your score on an IQ test can literally save you or cost you your life. And sometimes they'll use IQ tests in family court where they're looking at parents and children's capabilities. So you're going to see them in forensic psychology. Now, those of you who've been diagnosed with a psychological disorder, you may have seen them used by your clinical psychologist too. Intellectual functioning is a common evaluation when it comes down to clinical diagnosis. Not only are we looking at your symptoms of anxiety, depression, or whatnot, but a lot of times in the more serious intellectual disorders, or psychological disorders, they're also going to want to evaluate your intellectual functionings. Now, quick note, you'll see the star right here. Anytime they use an IQ test in a really important diagnostic process, it's always a one-on-one test. Okay, so if you have a learning disorder and you go to the school psychologist, you get a test which is a one-on-one test where the test giver sits right there and asks you questions. If you go to family court or you're in forensic court, typically anytime you're taking an IQ test for a court setting, it's going to be administered one-on-one. And same thing with the clinical setting. Why do we do this? Well, there are a lot of factors that tend to affect people's score on IQ tests. If English is not your first language, it's going to affect your ability to do well on the test. If you have some sort of dyslexia, it's going to affect your ability to do well on the test. So the one-on-one evaluation allows the evaluator to cut through these other factors which may or may not affect your ability to perform well on an IQ test. But when we're comparing a bunch of kids like elementary third graders, we don't have the ability to do one-on-one tests. And the assumption is that all children speak the language and are able to read and write well enough. So you're going to get the pencil and paper test. Now, you're also going to get pencil and paper tests in business settings. Did you know that there are some businesses, the NFL being one of the very famous examples, that actually gives IQ tests to all of their incoming employees? The NFL uses the Wonderlic IQ test, and they will use this to gauge the client's intellectual abilities. Did you know there was actually a Supreme Court case where the Supreme Court ruled that it was acceptable for a New Hampshire police department not to hire a gentleman because he scored too high on the IQ test? Their research and experience had showing this New Hampshire police department that people with really high IQs found police work boring, and they didn't want to waste their money training this fellow only to have him quit. So they did not hire this guy because he scored too high on an IQ test. He took it all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court eventually. Oh, man, I've really got to figure out my internet here. It's kind of annoying me how it does that. I think I'm back now. Okay, so you'll see them in business settings. So you're going to see them in schools. You're going to see them by school psychologists. You're going to see them by forensic psychologists. You're going to see them used by clinical psychologists, and you're going to see them used by industrial organizational psychologists. Now, what I want you to know is that an IQ test is different than lots of other tests. An IQ test is what we call an aptitude test. It measures your ability to learn. You may not know everything, but how quick are you at learning things? IQ tests are designed to be aptitude tests. They evaluate your overall ability to learn, not just your knowledge for a set of facts. You can learn a set of facts and still not be an intelligent person. Intelligence is your ability to reason, to learn new things, and to figure things out. On the other hand, we're going to differentiate. So we're going to differentiate IQ tests, which are aptitude tests, from all kinds of other tests that you may see. So this weekend, you're taking a test for my class. Is this test a measure of your intelligence? Absolutely not. Instead, my test is going to evaluate whether or not you have learned a set of facts from the last 4 chapters, 5, 6, 7, and 8. My test is what's known as an achievement test. It evaluates how well you learned a set of information related to a topic. So when they give you IQ tests in first grade or in third grade, these tests are not seeing if you're reading on grade level. Instead, they're trying to evaluate how well you are going to do in school because you are a clever person. Does everybody understand the difference between an achievement test and an aptitude test? On your exam, I'm going to give you the example of one or the other, and I want you to know the difference between an aptitude test and an achievement test. An IQ tests are designed to measure your reasoning ability, your speed of learning, the quality with which your mind works at all things. So an aptitude test is it's supposed to be content-free, and instead it measures your ability to reason. And as I said, you're going to see all the different places that you'll see these IQ tests. Now, let's step back a little bit. Where were IQ tests invented? They were actually invented in France by a fellow named Alfred Binet. He actually wasn't a psychologist. He was a lawyer, but he was asked by the Ministry of Education to identify a to create a test to identify children who might need extra resources or special education. So if you've ever been in a class, you'll notice that sometimes there's somebody in the class that doesn't get it quite as quickly as the rest of you do. And the teacher has to stop and spend time on that one student. Now, back 150 years ago, if a child had an intellectual disability or a learning disorder, they may slow the whole class down. And so the French government got this idea in the 19th century. Hey, let's find a way to find those students who maybe need extra help, get them out of class, and get them some extra resources so they could do well like the other kids. So that's why Alfred Binet was asked to design this test. Now, what he did was he created a quick test with 30 questions where he could try to gauge what he thought was your mental age. How smart was your mind? Were you thinking like a 2-year-old? Were you thinking like a 3-year-old? Were you thinking like a 4-year-old? Were you thinking like a 5-year-old? And so we had questions that went from really, really easy all the way up to very difficult questions. And he thought he could tell how old your mind was. He would then compare that to your chronological age to see if you were ahead or behind. So if you think about it, if your mental age is 9 and you're only a 6-year-old, you are 1.5 again times ahead of your peers. On the other hand, if you're 7 years old and your mental age is 7 years old, your ratio is 1 and you are right on target. On the other hand, if you are 6 years old and your mental age is 4, your ratio is less than 1 and you are behind your classmates. So what he used was this ratio method. Think of it as a good correlate is to think of it as when you were in school. Do you remember they told you if you were reading on grade level or at grade level or ahead of grade level or behind grade level? Do any of you remember that language? Ahead or behind grade level? If you heard that, that was sort of this idea of the ratio method, comparing your mental age to your chronological age. Now, a fellow named William Stern at Stanford thought that this test was great, and he brought it over and renormed it to find out how to compare the average American 2-year-old, 3-year-old, and 4-year-old. And he got the cool idea of multiplying the score times 100 so you didn't have a percentage in there. And so that's how historically the number 100 became known as the average intelligence score. If you take an IQ test and your standardized score comes out to 100, it means you are average. And now, that number doesn't mean the same thing that this test down here means, but 100 has been used as the arbitrary average for an IQ score. All right, now, modern IQ testing came as a result. The popularity of IQ testing can all be traced back to World War I. I don't know if you knew this, but the IQ test had been invented in 1912, and it was sort of a scientific and intellectual oddity, an item of interest. And then World War I broke out, and the U.S. military got the cool idea that they could use this test to figure out how best to use their pool of labor. So they wanted to figure out who the most clever recruits were and give them the hardest jobs, and then find those recruits that were the most challenged and give them the easiest job. So the first widespread use of the IQ test was in World War I. The Army called it the Army Alpha Test. A for Alpha. You know how the Army is. And they revised that test a little while later, and you know what they called it? The Army Beta Test. You now know what that IQ test that the Army gives to all incoming recruits is called? It's called the ASVAB, the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery. Remember that word from this test right here? Aptitude test. See where it says aptitude test? It is now known as the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery. And it's basically an IQ test designed for 18-year-old military recruits. Now, this test was so stinking popular that people who wanted to make education fair thought that we need to use the IQ test to evaluate all students. Because back in 1912, the only way you could get to Harvard was if you went to a famous prep school in Boston or New York. You couldn't be a smart kid from North Dakota and ever have a chance of getting into Harvard or Yale or Princeton. There's no way because you didn't have the pedigree. But somebody thought that if we had a generalized IQ test that could compare students across the country, we could figure out who the clever kid was in Ohio and compare them the same way. All right. And so the first IQ tests were born. Now, modern IQ test, the most famous modern IQ test right now is what's known as the Wechsler scales. Anytime you go into a clinical psychologist, anytime you're involved in a court case, anytime you're getting a serious IQ test, chances are you're probably getting the Wechsler scales. Now, David Wechsler developed 3 sets of scales, one that was normed for preschool children, one that was normed for children, and then one that is normed for adults. What do you mean by normed? I mean, they set up the questions so that the one for the WIPC is easier than the questions on the one for the adults because 4-year-olds don't know as much as 20-year-olds. So when you're taking an IQ test, if you're from 4 to 6 years old, if you're a preschool kid, they'll give you the WIPC. And yes, did you know that you can measure IQ starting as early as 4 years of age? At about 4 years of age, whatever this thing is called IQ can be reliably measured starting at this age. So if you score and just like, I don't know if you've ever seen how doctors track babies' height and weight, and they can tell you if you're in the 23rd or 24th percentile. They can do the same thing with an IQ test. If you're in the 85th percentile at the age of 4, you know what? You will more than likely be in the 85th percentile at the age of 14, at 24, at 34, and 44. You will always stay at that percentile. You can reliably measure IQ starting at 4 years of age. Then they have one that they use in school. If you had a learning disorder diagnosed in 1st or 2nd grade, you probably took the WISC, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children. And if you're like me, or if you're go in for a clinical evaluation, or the courts want to see your intellectual functioning, you're probably going to be given the WAIS test, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. So those are the 3 most popular individual scales of IQ test. This is for the one-on-one test. Now, as I told you, when you're measuring kids' IQ in 3rd grade and you have to measure 20 million kids' IQ, you can't do that with an individual test. So instead, what they make are these standardized paper and pencil tests, just like the SAT that some of you have taken. And the Woodcock-Johnson is the most popular paper and pencil test. And this is the one that almost all of us take in 3rd grade. You actually have to pass 2 IQ tests. The Woodcock-Johnson measures the average IQ. And then if you score real high on the first IQ test, the Woodcock-Johnson, they'll usually give you a second, more challenging IQ test, and you have to do well on that one to get into the AG education in 3rd grade. And but typically the Woodcock-Johnson is the most popular paper and pencil one. Now, I do want you to know that the ASVAB is an IQ test for military recruits. Did you know that the SAT, the Scholastic Aptitude Test, they actually changed the aptitude to achievement about 5 or 6 years ago to be more like the ACT. But back in my day, it was called the Scholastic Aptitude Test. It was an IQ test for college students, and it was good at predicting how likely you were to finish your college degree in 5 years. And so the higher your score was, the more ready you were seen for college. It was an aptitude test for college students. And then the one that the NFL uses that a lot of businesses use is a paper and pencil test, just like the ASVAB and the SAT, and it's called the Wonderlic. It's a 50-item IQ test, really quick, down and dirty, that gives you a rough idea of the potential recruit's intellectual functioning. So these are all of the different types of IQ tests that you're going to see. Now, here's the deal. IQ tests use a different principle than the IQ tests that were designed back in the early 20th century. Do you remember I talked to you earlier and I said to you that Alfred Binet was interested in comparing the age of your mind with your chronological age, your mental age versus your chronological age. There's a problem with that approach, and that problem is adulthood, because your abilities peak out, they mature just like every other maturing ability, and then they don't really change. And so you can't use age in the denominator anymore. What would it mean to say that my mind is 40 and my age is 52? Does that mean I'm below average intelligence, or does it mean my mind is working like a younger child's? So in the sense, you can't use the deviation method for adults, okay? You can't compare children to others the same age. You can't use the ratio method. You have to use the deviation method. What do we mean when we say the deviation method? Instead of trying to figure out how old your mind is, what I'm going to do is to compare you to everybody who is the same age and see how you deviate from the average. If you look underneath me, what you're going to see are the distribution of scores for people who take the IQ test, and this represents about 99% of the population. What you're going to find is that when people take the IQ test, some of them don't score very well. They're down at the bottom in that 2.3%. Sometimes these people might even get a diagnosis of intellectual deficiency, okay, an intellectual disorder. Now, some people score higher on the score, and you'll notice at the bottom we have IQ numbers from 70 to 130. These are standardized scores, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But in a sense, some of the people score 70, some of the people score higher than those 70, they score in the 80s. Some of those people score 100, some of those people score. And the height of the curve tells you what percentage of the population scores that high. So what you're going to notice is that most of the people that take an IQ test are lumped somewhere in the middle of that. So this, for example, is all of the 53-year-olds just like me who are taking the IQ test. Some of us score in the middle and some of us score on the extremes. In the deviation method, what you do is you look at how the scores are distributed. Now, this only works if you have a normal distribution, but it turns out that just like height, weight, and shoe size, IQ test scores tend to be normally distributed, with most of the people falling somewhere in the middle and fewer people at the extreme scores. And so what you do is you compare everybody, you compare yourself to your peer group. So in order to create norms for this test, what the test makers did was they went out and they found 1,000 people my age and they gave them this IQ test. And they found out how those people scored. Now, they may have given them 250 questions. It may be 300 questions. I'm not sure. But they gave them a certain number of questions. And they distributed those people from the person who got the fewest number of questions to the person who got the most number of questions. And what you're going to find is that some people, a few people got almost all the questions right. A few people got almost all the questions wrong, but most people are going to fall somewhere in the middle. And then what they do is they go and give a standardized score. They find the exact middle of that distribution and they give them the standardized score of 100. Your standard score is 100. Well, I answered 35 questions. Well, that's the middle number of scores, so you get 100. And what we're going to do is everybody that got more questions right than you gets a number over 100, and everybody who got fewer questions right than you gets a number less than 100. And what you're going to find is that the number of questions they get correctly are going to kind of look like this normal distribution. And what they're going to do is they're going to assign you an arbitrary number, which is what we call a standardized score, that's drawn from the actual number of questions you got right on the test. Now, what you're going to find is that most people are in the middle. 68.3% of the people in an IQ test at any given age are going to score somewhere in the big lump in the middle of the test. Now, these people are actually what we call, there's a statistical reason for determining the number of the people. This is all the people that fall within one standard deviation of the average. So if you get an average, you can then calculate how far on average people fall from the average, okay? And on average, how people fall from the average is known as the standard deviation. And you go one standard deviation up and one standard deviation below the middle score. And what that represents is 68.3% of a normally distributed population. So anybody who scores in the middle of this distribution is going to get a number somewhere between 85 and 115. Remember, these are standardized numbers that represent how many questions you got right on the exam. And these people represent what we would call the average of extremes, okay? The average score. These people are average in intelligence, okay? Now, if you give people an IQ test, and let's say it has 250 items, 2/3 of those people are going to fall somewhere in the middle. But what you're going to find is that about 15% of those people are going to fall to the top tail, and about 15% of those people are going to fall on the bottom part, or are going to score even farther below. And these people represent the extremes of intelligence. From 115 to 130, that represents about 13% of this distribution, and you're going to get a designation of what we call above average in intelligence. If you score in the bottom 13.6% down here from 70 to 85, you might get a designation of below average in intelligence. Now, what you're going to find is that only 5% of the population in a normally distributed distribution falls at the very, very extreme. The top 2.5% and the bottom 2.5% are also given designations. If you take an IQ test and you get more questions right than 97.5% of the rest of the population, you are going to get a diagnosis of gifted. They're going to use that word gifted. Sometimes you hear the word genius, but the word that's going to be used in school is you are gifted. And that means that you fall at the very top end of this distribution. Now, if you happen to represent the bottom 2.5% of the distribution, okay, you may get another word. Now, here's the deal. To get a diagnosis of intellectual disability, not only do you have to score poorly on the IQ test, but you also have to show an inability to take care of your day-to-day functions. There are some people who maybe have a personality that is so difficult, that's dyslexia is so bad that they can't do well on an IQ test, and their IQ test shows them to be really low on the IQ score. But they still have a job, they still take care of their kids, they still have money, they still meet all of their obligations. So for these type of people, it's not proper to give them that diagnosis of intellectual disability. So if you've ever seen somebody with Down syndrome who's been given a diagnosis of intellectual disability, we don't call it mental retardation anymore, but what you're going to see is a lot of people with Down syndrome are going to have a mild intellectual disability. Their IQ is going to be somewhere in the 60s. And what you're going to find is that not only do these people have the low IQ score, but they can't live on their own independently. And so those two factors have to be there to get a diagnosis of intellectual disability. Okay? Now, so here's the deal. The old IQ tests were built using this idea of the ratio method. How old was your mind compared to your body? But this only works for children when intelligence is developing in one direction. But for adults, you can't use the ratio method, so we use this deviation method. And what they do is they give you a bunch of they give a bunch of questions to a group of people who are at each age. They find out how those group of people score from the best person who gets the most number of questions right, to the person who gets the fewest number of questions right. And they make what's known as a frequency distribution. And the more people who score in a different area, the higher the curve goes. And what you're going to find is that the frequency distribution for people on an IQ test is going to be roughly normal, with most of the people scoring in the middle and fewer people scoring on the ends. Now, here's the deal. Every 10 years, they have to renorm the test. They have to go back and see what the distribution looks like. And it turns out there's this really bizarre phenomenon with IQ tests. Every generation gets more questions right than the previous generation. So the score it takes to get 100 keeps getting higher. It's harder to score average on an IQ test than it was 50 years ago. In fact, if you compare IQ, the number of questions right from 80 years ago, let's say in 1940 to today, people who score average on an IQ test today would have scored gifted in 1950. So every 10 years we have to look at this distribution and find out how many questions right do you have to get right before you are in the middle of the distribution. It's called renorming a test. And IQ test renormings have shown this thing called the Flynn effect. Each generation scores higher on an IQ test than previous generations. So your parents might be in the 50th percentile for intelligence with their age group, and you are in the 50th percentile for your age group. But it turns out that your age group scores better on an IQ test than your parents do. So actually, even if you both have the same percentile score, you know more than your parents do. I hope that makes sense, all right? But that's how we look at IQ tests. Now, I actually haven't talked about what's actually on an IQ test. What exactly does an IQ test measure? It measures some form of reasoning, but let's talk more specifically about that. All right. Back in the early days, the 20s and 30s, testing theorists used to ask the question, is IQ one thing? Is there just one overall intellectual ability that people have that helps them do math and reading? Or can we think of intelligence as being a bunch of different S's? So is it one general thing, or is it several specific things? Now, I'm sure all of you can answer this question for me. It is more than just one thing. How many of you are really, really good in math, but you hate English and history and struggle in those subjects? So how many of you have better mathematical ability than verbal ability? On the other hand, how many of you out there are really good at English and reading, but you are absolutely terrified of and not good at math? I'll bet each and every one of you out there is kind of like me in that you're either better at math or better at English class, right? Does anybody have that experience? I'm above average in math, but I'm really gifted when it comes to reading and writing and verbal skills. So I can tell you that you should think of intelligence as being more than one thing. All right? And so the first IQ test treated IQ as one unified ability. Alfred Binet, either you did well on the IQ test or you didn't do well on the IQ test. But early critics thought that we should actually try to start dividing it up into its component parts. And some of these people even suggested throwing away the total score and just looking at the components. Now, what I will tell you is when you take an IQ test, and if you listen to most people talk, they talk about IQ as one number. So when people talk about IQ these days as one number, when it's used in court settings, it's used as one number, a G. But when you see IQ tests used in school settings, they appreciate and accept the fact that IQ is more than one G. It is several S's. So when you take an IQ test, a seated IQ test, a one-on-one IQ test specifically, what you're going to do is you're going to get one overall number called your general IQ number or your full scale IQ number. But you know what? You're also going to get a set of other numbers as well. You're going to get an IQ for your verbal ability and an IQ for your nonverbal reasoning or performance ability. Okay, so if any of you have an IQ report that you took from a clinical psychologist, go back and look at that report. And what you'll see is that they gave you an overall IQ number, and then they gave you a verbal IQ number and a performance IQ number. Now, those numbers are going to be standardized, and they are going to look just like the typical IQ number does, where 100 means average, above 115 means 115 to 130 is going to mean above average, 130 and plus is going to mean gifted. Same thing going the other way. Between 85 and 70 is below average. Below 70 is going to be intellectual disability. Okay, so you're going to get a full-scale IQ, and you're also going to get an evaluation of your verbal reasoning abilities and your mathematical or nonverbal reasoning abilities. Okay, so your IQ test is at least going to split you into these two broad categories. And like I said, you folks intuitively know this because some of you, all of you, are better at one than the other. Now, here's the deal. You will very rarely ever see somebody whose performance and verbal IQ scales are on different sides of average. There are very few cases where somebody will have an above average verbal reasoning ability and be below average in their performance, their nonverbal ability. Almost always you will see them on the same side. One may not be as high as the other, but typically they're going to go in the same direction. If they don't go in the same direction, that is potential evidence of a learning disorder. Now, IQ tests, in order to help clinical psychologists really diagnose specific learning disorders, not only do they give you just a general verbal ability and a performance ability, but those general abilities are both broken down into specific tasks or abilities that you can use. So for example, if you look over here at your verbal ability, down below that it has two categories, and then look at the very bottom row. These are the specific abilities that make up your verbal reasoning ability. How big is your vocabularies? How subtle are you at detecting differences and similarities between different categories and objects? Your general information ability, your ability to read and comprehend what you read. So these are 4 different specific abilities that go into your verbal reasoning ability. Did you know that your simple arithmetic is considered a non-mathematical ability? Because your times tables and your simple math, your addition and subtraction, are not mathematical skills. They're actually rote memory. When I think of the answer to 3 plus 2, I don't visually add 3 dots to 2 dots in my mind and do a mathematical equation. I just have remembered that 3 plus 2 equals 5. And so your ability to do your arithmetic. Do you remember when we talked last chapter about your short-term memory, and I said that you have the ability to hold 7 plus or minus 2 chunks? Well, your digit span is the size of your individual short-term memory. Some people can remember more than 7 objects. Some people can remember less than 7 objects. Digit span is an item on the test where they test your short-term memory ability. The clinical psychologist will actually give you lists and have you repeat those lists back to them forward and backwards to see how many words you can hold in your brain at one time. And then letter number sequencing. They give you codes to do, and they want to see how good you are at utilizing letters and numbers and differentiating between the two. And so the weird thing, what you're going to find is that you can use patterns. Okay, so here's the deal. In people who don't have an intellectual disability, what you're going to find is that all of these scores are going to be similar to one another. Just like your verbal and performance IQ should be on the same side, all of these specific abilities should be on the same side, either above average or below average intelligence. But what you're going to find is that some people who have ADD, they're going to do well at all of these tasks except for the digit span. Their short-term memory is going to be really, really poor. All of the other numbers will be really, really high, but that will be really, really poor. And that's evidence to your clinical psychologist that your verbal reasoning ability is good, but whenever it comes time to keep things in your mind, you can't pay attention well enough to keep those things in your mind. And so a full IQ scale, your one number score is great for the military because they've got 15 million recruits and they want to group you into above average, average, and below average. But anytime you're in a clinical setting, they're not just interested in the full scale IQ number at the top. They're looking for the patterns of subscores too, because those subscores allow them to diagnose specific disabilities that you might have. If any of you were diagnosed with a learning disorder, chances are somewhere there's a report showing how your pattern of specific ability scores demonstrates evidence for that learning disorder. Because a learning disorder is defined as a narrow academic difficulty that affects your academic performance in a person with otherwise normal intelligence. So the deal is, if you have a learning disorder, your IQ score is going to be 105. Hell, it might even be 110 or 115. You might even be above average intelligence. But your digit span score is going to be really, really low and different from all the other scores. And so I'm going to say, see, this person has a normal verbal reasoning ability, but their short-term memory is really, really bad. And so what happens is IQ test scores, you get lots of different numbers from an IQ test score. Most people only think about and only talk about your one number at the top, your full-scale IQ score. But clinical psychologists are more interested in looking at the patterns of subscores underneath them. All right, now quickly, behavioral genetics is a branch of science that allows us to try and figure out what abilities, what qualities of humans are genetically determined and what ones are determined by the environment. And simply what they use is simple logic, but it's called behavioral genetics because they look at the outcome, the behavioral outcome. So your ability on an IQ test would be the behavior of interest. And we look at the genetics behind that behavior, behavioral genetics. And so what they're going to do is they're going to compare the IQ scores of people who have different levels of genetic similarity. So how similar is your IQ test to your identical brother or sister if you have one? How similar is your IQ score to your regular brother or sister if you have one? How similar is your IQ to your aunt or your uncle? Because you share a little bit of genetic material with them. Now, the thing is, you share more genetic material with your identical twin than you do with your dad. You share more more IQ material, genetic material with your dad than you do with your brother. You share more genetic material with your brother than you do with your uncle or aunt. All right. And so what you would see is there should be a high, if there is a genetic trait, you will see a higher correlation if we compare groups of higher genetic similarity. And what you're going to see as a general rule is that siblings that share genetic material, identical twins, if you'll notice, identical twins have a higher similarity on IQ tests than siblings. So you'll see your identical twins up here with the genetic similarity of 1. You're going to notice that they have a much higher correlation in their IQ scores than siblings raised together or raised apart. Now, one of the things that you can do is you can also look at environmental studies to see how important the environment is. So if you look at the IQ correlation differences between siblings that are raised together and siblings that are raised apart, you'll see that the IQs of siblings raised together is a little bit higher than the correlation of siblings raised apart. So you'll see that there is an effect of environment as well. But I will tell you that the IQ test scores are heavily affected by genes and less heavily affected by environment. Now, quickly, in chapter 4, I told you that one of the things that really worries doctors about people using teratogenic substances like smoking and alcohol is that sometimes smoking or alcohol or other drugs will cause you to deliver your baby early. And what you're going to find is that along with all kinds of other problems that low birth weight babies have, what you're going to see is that as a general rule, low birth weight babies are going to have lower IQs in general. Now, that doesn't mean that you aren't a low birth weight baby that still has an above average IQ. That still happens. But I'm saying in all of the low birth weight babies, as a general rule, their IQ scores aren't going to be as high as babies who are carried to normal birth weight. And so that's why we're interested in and this is would be an environmental effect, if you will. So what affects IQ? Genes definitely affect IQ. However, the reason that we care about teratogens is because the environment does have a small effect on IQ, and especially if it causes you to be born before you come to full term. Okay, that's all I have to say for today's class. I want to thank the 4 hearty individuals that came and stayed through this whole class. I really appreciate that. Thanks for coming, Angelina. Thanks for coming, Eric. And I want to give all of you a round of applause. Thank you very much for coming. You're a great audience. Don't forget, we have class on Thursday. There will be a review session for the exam Friday morning, and exam number 2 will become available Friday morning and is due this Sunday at 11:59 p.m. Any questions? I'll take questions in the chat bar after I log off of the broadcast. Otherwise, I'm going to say goodbye. Have a great day, and I will see you on Thursday. Take care. Thanks for coming! Exclamation point.